The forest had a way of pulling you in, wrapping you in its silence. Ravenswood was known for its mist, thick and almost alive, swallowing the world in a cold embrace. That morning, the mist was different. It hung lower, heavier, as if it carried the weight of something unspeakable. I walked the path that led to Alder Creek, a narrow trail that cut through the heart of the woods. It was where they found the last missing person. What was left of them? The town whispered about the symbols, etched into the dirt, symbols that didn't belong in any language we knew. They said the marks pulsed faintly when touched, a low hum that made the air feel electric. The deeper I went, the more the world seemed to warp. Ekdanshan, seemed to warp. The trees weren't just tall, they loomed, their branches clawing at the sky. The sound of my boots on the damp earth was the only thing tethering me to reality. But then I heard it, a low, guttural noise that didn't belong. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't human. I froze. The noise came again, closer this time, reverberating through my chest like the echo of a scream trapped in time. The forest felt alive, its shadows shifting, pressing against me. My breath came in shallow bursts as I scanned the area, every instinct screaming at me to run, but I didn't. Ahead, through the thick curtain of mist, I saw movement, a shape, hunched and wrong, dragging something behind it. My stomach churned as I stepped closer, the metallic tang of blood cutting through the damp air. The body, it was unmistakable now. Limbs twisted at unnatural angles, eyes wide open, staring into nothing. The symbols were carved into the ground around it, deep and deliberate, glowing faintly in the dim light. I knelt, my hands trembling, and traced one of the markings, the hum they talked about. It was real. It vibrated up through my fingertips, settling deep in my bones like a warning. A sudden sound snapped my attention upward. The figure was gone. Just the body and the suffocating silence remained. My pulse raced as I stumbled back, nearly losing my footing. The symbols seemed brighter now, as if feeding off my fear. I didn't hear it approach. One moment, the world was still. The next, a shadow loomed over me. The shape wasn't human. Its eyes glowed a sickly amber, and its elongated limbs twitched with an unnatural rhythm. Its face, or what should have been its face, was an abyss, a void that sucked in the light around it. I couldn't move. My body betrayed me, rooted to the spot as the thing tilted its head, studying me with a curiosity that felt predatory. When it moved, it was too fast, too sudden. The world blurred as I was thrown backward. The wind knocked from my lungs. The last thing I saw before I hit the ground was the symbols flaring to life, their light searing into my vision like a brand. The creature leaned in close, the void of its face filling my world. And then darkness. Darkness. When I came to, the forest was silent again. The mist had lifted slightly, revealing the first rays of dawn, piercing through the treetops. The body was gone. The symbols were gone. Only the disturbed earth remained, a cruel reminder that what I saw was real. I staggered back to town, my mind a whirlwind of terror and disbelief. I couldn't explain it, but I knew one thing. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't done. Ravenswood wasn't safe. Every Hall, sharp. And I had to figure out what it wanted before it came back. The morning after the woods, my body ached with a heaviness that wasn't just physical. It was as if the forest had crawled under my skin, burrowing into my mind like a parasite. I couldn't shake the image of those symbols, their faint hum resonating in my skull every time I closed my eyes. The town felt different now, its streets too quiet, its air too still. People walked with their heads down, avoiding eye contact, as if sensing that something was amiss. I tried to push through the crowd unnoticed, but it was impossible to escape the whispers. They knew I had been in the forest. They knew something had happened. At the library, I combed through old maps of Ravenswood. The markings, those symbols, had to mean something. They were random. The librarian, Mrs. Hargrove, watched me from behind her desk, her gaze sharp and unyielding. When I asked her if she'd seen anything like the symbols, her expression darkened. "You should leave that alone," she said, her voice low, almost a hiss. "Some things in Ravenswood are better left buried." Her words lingered as I returned to the maps, tracing paths and trails, searching for connection. That's when I saw it. The creek where I found the body. It wasn't marked on any current maps, but on the older ones, it was labeled Black Hollow. Alongside it was an inscription in faint, almost illegible script. "Beware the binding." The name alone sent a shiver through me. I scanned the page for more, but the words offered no explanation, no comfort, only a foreboding silence, as if the paper itself carried the weight of whatever had been written there. By the time I left the library, the sun was sinking behind the trees, casting long shadows across the town. I didn't want to go home. The walls of my apartment felt suffocating, the silence too loud. Instead, I walked, letting my feet carry me aimlessly until I found myself at the edge of Ravenswood Cemetery. The gates groaned as I pushed them open, the air inside thick with the scent of earth and decay. The graves stretched out in neat rows, their headstones weathered by time. I wasn't sure what I was looking for until I saw it, a mausoleum at the far end, its door slightly ajar. The sight filled me with a sense of dread, but also an inexplicable pull. I approached cautiously, my steps crunching against the gravel. The inside was dark, the air cold and stale. The floor was covered in a fine layer of dirt, and there, in the center, were more of the symbols. These were different, though. They were carved into the stone, deeper, more precise. They glowed faintly, just like in the woods. their light pulsating with an almost hypnotic rhythm. My breath hitched as I reached out, my fingers hovering above the carvings. The air shifted. A chill ran down my spine as the temperature dropped suddenly, the faint sound of whispers filling the space. I turned sharply, expecting to see someone or something, but the room was empty. The symbols flared brighter, their glow searing into the walls, casting eerie shadows that danced and twisted. The whispers grew louder, their voices overlapping, forming a cacophony of sound that made my head throb. And then I heard it. A name. My name. I'll live. Egtus. This. Clear and unmistakable. Spoken in a voice that wasn't mine. That wasn't human. I stumbled back, my heart hammering against my ribs. Envelop. The whispers stopped, leaving a deafening silence in their wake. The glow of the symbols faded, and the room felt still again, as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. I could feel it. The air was heavier, charged with a presence I couldn't see but knew was there. I ran, the shadows of the cemetery stretching and clawing at me as I fled. By the time I reached the street, I was gasping for breath, my hands trembling. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Whatever I had disturbed in that mausoleum wasn't just a part of the forest. It was bigger, older, and it wasn't finished with me yet. The next morning, the world outside my window felt alien, like a stage set hastily thrown together to distract me from the truth. I couldn't shake the whispers from the mausoleum, the way they'd called my name in that otherworldly voice. My apartment was suffocating, the walls too close, the air too thin. I needed to move, to do something, anything that would ground me in reality. I grabbed my jacket and headed out into the cold light of dawn. The streets of Ravenswood were eerily quiet, a ghost town draped in fog. My steps carried me to Black Hollow Creek before I even realized where I was going. The forest loomed, its skeletal branches reaching out like claws. I told myself I was going back for answers, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. The pull I felt wasn't rational. It was primal. The creek looked different in the daylight. The water was murky, sluggish, and the air above it shimmered faintly, as if distorted by heat waves. I knelt by the edge, my fingers skimming the surface. It felt colder than ice, a sharp contrast to the mild autumn air. My breath caught as I noticed something glinting beneath the water. A shard of glass, jagged and dark. I reached in, the cold biting into my skin, and pulled it free. It wasn't glass. Why? It was obsidian, smooth and impossibly black. Yet it seemed to pulse faintly in my hand. The surface reflected not just my face, but something behind me. A shadow that moved even though I was alone. I whipped around, heart pounding, but the forest was empty. The obsidian shard felt heavier the longer I held it, as if it were leeching something from me. I stuffed it into my pocket, hoping to shake the unease, and stood to leave. But that's when I saw the footprints, Wet, bare footprints leading away from the creek and into the forest. They weren't mine. Only shadows. They were too large, too uneven, the imprint of claws faintly visible at the edges. I followed them, my steps hesitant but deliberate. Each footprint seemed fresher than the last, the ground beneath them damp and glistening. They led me deeper into the woods, the trees closing in until the light barely reached the ground. My pulse quickened as I spotted something up ahead, a clearing, the center dominated by a stone altar. The altar was ancient, its surface carved with the same symbols I'd seen in the mausoleum. Surrounding it were remnants of candles, their wax melted into the ground, and a circle of bones arranged in a pattern I couldn't decipher. The air here was thick, almost syrupy, and carried a metallic tang that made my stomach churn. I approached cautiously, my hand brushing against the obsidian shard in my pocket. The symbols on the altar began to glow faintly, their light pulsing in time with the shard's rhythm. My vision blurred, and for a moment, the forest around me flickered. It was as if I were caught between two realities, the familiar woods and something darker, colder. The flickering stopped as abruptly as it started, leaving me disoriented. That's when I noticed the figure standing across the clearing. It wasn't a person, it was a shape, tall and humanoid, but its edges wavered like smoke. Its eyes, or where its eyes should have been, glowed with a dim, sickly light. The thing didn't move, but its presence was suffocating. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs were frozen in place. The shard in my pocket grew unbearably hot, burning through the fabric until I dropped it onto the ground with a gasp. The figure tilted its head, the motion eerily slow and deliberate. The whispers from the mausoleum returned, louder this time, overlapping and clashing until they became a deafening roar. The ground beneath me trembled, the symbols on the altar flaring to life. My vision dimmed, the world spinning as the figure stepped closer, and then everything stopped. The whispers, the trembling, the glow, they all ceased in an instant. The figure was gone, the clearing empty. All that remained was the shard, now cool and dull, lying in the dirt at my feet. I stumbled back, my breath ragged, and turned to run. The forest seemed alive now, the trees twisting and writhing as if watching me. By the time I reached the edge of the woods, I was drenched in sweat, my legs barely able to carry me. The shard was still in my pocket. I should have left it behind, but I couldn't. It was mine now, a piece of whatever this was, bound to me, in a way I couldn't escape. As I walked back into town, I realized one thing with chilling certainty. The woods hadn't let me go. They'd merely let me leave. For now. The shard burned in my pocket, its weight pressing against my leg like an anchor. Every step away from the woods felt heavier, as if the thing in my possession didn't want me to leave. The sky above Ravenswood had darkened unnaturally fast, and by the time I reached the edge of town, it felt like dusk had descended early. My apartment was no refuge. The air inside was stifling, thick with the faint metallic tang that had permeated the forest clearing. The shard's surface was dull now, but the memory of its glow haunted me. I placed it on the kitchen counter, half expecting it to pulse back to life. It didn't. Still, I couldn't bring myself to look away from it. As night fell, the world outside my window seemed to walk. The streetlights flickered, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. A faint hum buzzed in my ears, growing louder until it became a low, guttural vibration. The noise wasn't coming from inside my apartment. It was outside. I hesitated before pulling back the curtains. The street below was empty, save for a single figure standing directly beneath the lamppost. It was tall and skeletal, its silhouette flickering like a faulty hologram. My breath caught as I realized it wasn't standing still. It was watching me, though it had no eyes. The weight of its gaze pinned me in place. The shard on the counter trembled, emitting a faint hum that matched the vibration in the air. My hands clenched the edge of the sink as I fought the urge to touch it. But the pull was undeniable. My body moved as if on its own, my fingers brushing the cool, smooth surface of the obsidian. The instant I touched it, the world around me changed. The hum transformed into a deafening roar, and the apartment dissolved into darkness. I was standing in the woods again, though the clearing had vanished. The trees loomed closer, their twisted branches forming an archway ahead. The same glowing symbols from the altar now marked the bark, pulsating with an eerie rhythm. The figure was there, standing at the entrance of the archway. Its form was clearer now, its outline sharper. Its limbs were unnaturally long, its movements slow and deliberate. The glow in its hollowed eye sockets was more vivid, pulsating in time with the symbols around me. It raised a hand, beckoning me forward. I wanted to turn and run, but my legs carried me toward the archway. Every step felt like sinking into quicksand, the ground beneath me, shifting and pulling me down. The air grew colder, biting at my skin as I passed beneath the arch. On the other side was something I couldn't comprehend. It was a void, endless and consuming. The ground beneath me had disappeared. But I wasn't falling. I was suspended in nothingness, weightless and powerless. Around me, whispers swirled, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of rage, despair, and something else. The figure appeared again, closer this time. Its features were more defined. Its skin stretched tight over a face that wasn't human. It tilted its head, studying me, and raised a finger to the empty space where its mouth should have been. The whispers stopped. "You carry the shard," a voice said, though it came from everywhere and nowhere. "It binds you." My mouth was dry. My voice caught in my throat. I wanted to scream, to deny it, but the shard in my hand pulsed in agreement. "Why me?" I finally choked out, though the words sounded small and hollow. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it reached out, its bony hand passing through my chest. The pain was immediate and searing, like fire spreading through my veins. My vision blurred, the void spinning around me until I was back in the clearing. The shard was still in my hand, its surface now cracked and glowing faintly. My chest heaved as I gasped for air, the lingering pain making it hard to think. The symbols on the trees had stopped glowing, but the forest was alive with movement. Shadows darted between the trees, watching, waiting. Envelopes, how do? I stumbled out of the clearing, the shard's glow lighting my way through the darkened woods. The pull to return to the archway was strong, but fear kept me moving. When I finally broke through the tree line and into the open, the weight of the shard disappeared. I looked down at my hand, only to find it empty, but I could still feel it, embedded somewhere deeper than flesh. The shard wasn't gone. It was part of me now. And whatever had given it to me wasn't done. Wasn't done. The following days blurred together, each one heavier than the last. I stayed in my apartment, curtains drawn and phone turned off. Envious Avistepi, the shard, or whatever essence of it had lodged itself within me, was dormant, but its presence lingered, a subtle vibration just beneath my skin. Sleep was fleeting, and when it came, it brought dreams that bled into waking nightmares. The whispers were the first sign that I was losing my grip. They began as faint murmurs, easily drowned out by the hum of my refrigerator or the distant buzz of traffic. But they grew louder, more insistent, weaving into my thoughts like vines. Sometimes they spoke in broken fragments of a language I didn't understand. Other times they hissed my name, dragging it through the dark like a threat. I avoided mirrors. Their reflection staring back at me felt wrong. My eyes were ringed with dark shadows, my skin pale and raw. But it was more than that. There were moments when the person in the mirror didn't move with me. A twitch of the lips when mine remained still. A blink, a second too late. It wasn't me. Well, certainly, was she late. By the third night, I couldn't stay in the apartment any longer. The walls seemed to close in, the air growing heavy and oppressive. I left with no destination in mind, wandering through the empty streets of Ravenswood. The town felt abandoned, each shadow stretching longer than it should. Everywhere, to go, Canada. Streetlights flickered as I passed, casting faint halos on cracked pavement. It wasn't long before I found myself at the edge of the woods again. The forest loomed ahead, a dark maw, waiting to swallow me whole. I didn't want to go back in, but my legs moved on their own. The vibration beneath my skin grew stronger, pulling me forward like a magnet. The trees closed in around me, their twisted branches forming a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. The whispers were louder here, no longer fragmented but forming sentences that I could almost understand. They spoke of doors and keys, of binding and breaking, of an ancient hunger that needed to be fed. The clearing was different this time. The altar was gone, replaced by a shallow pool of black water that reflected no light. The air was heavy with the metallic tang I remembered, sharp enough to sting my nose. And standing at the edge of the pool was the figure. It turned as I approached, its hollow eyes fixed on me. The glow within them pulsed in rhythm with the vibration inside me, as if we were connected. It raised a skeletal hand, pointing to the pool. "You brought it," the voice said, though the figure's mouth never moved. The words resonated inside my head, each one pressing against my skull like a hammer. "Now, you must see." I wanted to run, to turn, and never look back. But my feet were rooted to the ground, my body no longer my own. I stepped forward, the black water rippling as I approached. The reflection staring back at me wasn't mine. It was the figures. The whispers reached a deafening crescendo. As I knelt at the edge of the pool, my hands moved without my consent, plunging into the water. It was ice cold, biting into my skin like shards of glass. And then I saw it. Visions flooded my mind, each one more horrifying than the last. Envelop, a town swallowed by shadows, its people consumed by darkness, a great maw opening in the earth, spilling forth tendrils of smoke and ash, and at the center of it all, the shard, glowing brighter than ever, its cracks multiplying until they formed a web of fractures. The pool dissolved, the clearing fading around me. I was somewhere else now, a void like the one I'd seen before, endless and consuming. The figure stood before me, closer than ever. Then, its hollow eyes burned with a light that pierced through me, stripping away every layer of who I was. "You will be the key," the voice said, and this time it was different. It wasn't a command, it was a sentence. The figure raised a hand, and the shard appeared between its fingers, whole and unbroken. It pressed the shard into my chest, and the pain was unlike anything I'd ever known. It wasn't physical. It was something deeper, more fundamental. More fundamental. When I woke, I was back in my apartment. The shard was gone, but its presence was stronger than ever. My reflection in the window stared back at me, its hollow eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. The following days were a blur of suffocating silence and unrelenting dread. My world shrank to the four corners of my apartment, but even there, I couldn't escape. The presence inside me wasn't dormant anymore. It stirred constantly, a slow, deliberate pulse that echoed in my chest, my head, my veins. Every thought I had felt like it wasn't entirely mine. I stopped eating, stalked, sleeping. The mirrors were covered now, but I still avoided glancing at any reflective surface. The few times I caught my face, in the faint glow of my phone screen, it wasn't entirely mine. My mouth moved when I hadn't spoken. My eyes seemed emptier, like the figure had taken a piece of me and left something else behind. The whispers evolved. They were no longer just faint murmurs that I could dismiss. They grew louder, more insistent, intertwining with my thoughts until I couldn't separate where they ended and I began. They told me things I didn't want to hear. Names, dates, places, all soaked in the scent of inevitability. Then came the marks. Lil. It started on my chest, just above where the shard had been pressed into my skin. A faint outline of a crack appeared one morning, delicate but unmistakable. By the end of the day, it had spread, spider webbing across my torso like veins of black ink. The marks pulsed faintly in the dark, as if they were alive. Touching them sent a wave of cold through me, like I was brushing against something that didn't belong in this world. And the dreams, they were worse. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in the clearing. The black pool reflecting horrors too vast to comprehend. The figure was always there, watching, waiting. Each time, it whispered the same phrase. You are the key. I didn't know what it meant, and I didn't want to know, but I couldn't avoid it any longer. That night, as the whispers became a chorus of screams, I found myself back in the woods. The air was heavier than before, thick with a metallic tang that coated my tongue. The trees seemed alive, their gnarled branches twisting toward me, as if they were trying to keep me out, or trap me inside. The clearing had changed again. The pool was gone, replaced by a spiral of jagged stones, each one etched with symbols that glowed faintly in the dark. In the center stood the figure, its hollow eyes locked on me, as if it had been waiting all along. You brought this upon yourself, the voice said, not aloud, but inside my head. It was a truth, not a taunt. The figure raised a skeletal hand, pointing at the spiral. Step inside. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to turn back, but my legs betrayed me. The pull of the marks on my skin was too strong. With each step, the whispers grew louder, more frantic, until they became a deafening roar. I couldn't tell if they were warning me or cheering me on. When I reached the center, the air shifted. The stones began to hum, their glow intensifying until it bathed the entire clearing in an eerie light. The figure approached, its movements unnervingly fluid. It raised its hand again, and this time a shard materialized in its palm. The shard. You must choose, it said, and the roar of the whispers fell silent, leaving a void that was almost worse. The shard floated toward me, spinning slowly, its cracks glowing faintly. What will you give to stop the end? I didn't understand. What end? I tried to ask, but my voice was swallowed by the weight of the silence. The figure didn't respond. It only stared, waiting. The shard pulsed. And in that moment, I saw everything. The visions from the pool returned, more vivid than before. The town swallowed by shadows, the earth splitting open, the endless void consuming everything. And then I saw myself at the center of it all, my body consumed by the same cracks that covered the shard. The realization hit me like a blow to the chest. The shard wasn't a key. I was. Me. Sue. May. Ways. And I knew what the figure was asking. And the ground trembled as the marks on my skin began to burn, the cracks spreading further, climbing my neck, my arms. The shard hovered inches from my chest, its glow intensifying. "What will you give?" the figure repeated, and this time I understood. "I want everything." That's what it wanted. My fear, my pain, my life. It wanted it all. The moment I reached for the shard, the world exploded into light. The trees loomed over us, their gnarled branches intertwining into a web that shut out the sky. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay, and the only sound was the crunch of leaves beneath our boots. There was something unsettling about the silence. No birds, no wind, just the oppressive quiet, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. We found the house just as the sun dipped below the horizon, its last light staining the sky, a deep, angry red. It wasn't much of a house anymore, just a skeleton of warped wood and shattered windows, sagging under the weight of time. But it was shelter, and we were grateful for it, or at least most of us were. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were trespassing somewhere we didn't belong. The others laughed and joked as they set up camp, their voices bouncing off the rotting walls of the cabin. But as night fell, the laughter faded, replaced by the soft hiss of the wind through the trees. It was colder than it should have been, and the shadows seemed to stretch farther than they should have. I stayed close to the fire, the flickering flames, a fragile barrier against the encroaching dark. The first time I heard it, I thought it was the wind, a faint whisper, just on the edge of hearing, slipping through the cracks in the walls. But it wasn't the wind. It was something else. Unwind, something deliberate. Words I couldn't quite make out, spoken in a voice that wasn't quite human. My pulse quickened, and I glanced at the others. They didn't seem to notice, their faces lit by the warm glow of the fire as they passed around a bottle of whiskey. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me. But the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, more insistent, threading through the night like a cold finger tracing the back of my neck. And then I saw it, a shadow that moved when it shouldn't have, darting across the corner of my vision. I turned, but there was nothing there, just the empty forest, dark and unyielding. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. The others looked at me, their expressions a mix of amusement and annoyance. One of them, Mark, I think, rolled his eyes. "Hear what?" he said, his voice tinged with mockery. "The wind? You're spooking yourself." I wanted to argue, to tell them about the whispers and the shadow, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I forced a laugh and shook my head, trying to convince myself that he was right, that I was just spooking myself. But then we found the amulet. It was buried in the dirt near the edge of the clearing, just a glint of metal catching the firelight. I don't know why I dug it up. Something about it called to me, an itch in the back of my mind that I couldn't ignore. When I pulled it free, I almost dropped it. It was cold, colder than it should have been, and the intricate patterns carved into its surface seemed to shift and writhe under the light. "Cool find," Mark said, snatching it from my hand before I could stop him. He held it up to the fire, squinting at the strange symbols. "Everyday stoma, bentakur," probably some old Native American artifact. "Worth a fortune, I bet." I wanted to tell him to put it back, to leave it where it was, but the words wouldn't come. My mouth was dry, my heart hammering against my ribs. There was something wrong with that amulet, something that made my skin crawl just looking at it. But Mark was already pocketing it, laughing as he turned back to the fire. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the rafters of the cabin, listening to the whispers that never stopped. They were louder now, clearer, but still just out of reach, like a song I couldn't quite remember. And then, just as I was starting to think I'd imagined it all, I heard footsteps. They were soft, barely more than a shuffle, but they were there, circling the cabin. My breath caught in my throat as I sat up, straining to see through the darkness. The fire had died down to embers, casting long, flickering shadows that danced across the walls. The others were asleep, their breathing slow and even. I was alone. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment there was nothing, just the silence, heavy and suffocating. And then the door creaked open. It was slow, deliberate, the kind of sound that makes your stomach twist in knots. My eyes darted to the door, but there was nothing there, just the dark, yawning, and infinite. And then the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening, pressing in on me from all sides. Indeed, from all sides. My chest tightened, my breath coming in shallow gasps. And then I saw it, a shadow, standing in the doorway. It was tall, impossibly thin, its edges blurring and shifting like smoke. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, as it stepped inside. The air grew colder with each step, frost creeping across the floorboards in its wake. It stopped in the center of the room, its head tilting to one side as though studying us, studying me. And then it smiled. En sual tief sur perl, or at least I think it did. But it didn't have a face, not really. But I felt it, that awful predatory grin that made my blood run cold. The last thing I remembered before everything went black was the sound of Mark screaming. It wasn't a human scream. It was raw, primal, filled with a terror so absolute that it made my soul ache. And then the world went silent. When I woke up, the amulet was gone. So was Mark. Tatil, Danny, Curly. Morning came reluctantly, the gray light seeping through the gaps in the cabin's broken walls like a reluctant confession. I barely slept, every creak of the rotting wood jolting me awake, my mind replaying Mark's scream on an endless loop. He was gone, and the others had no answers. Their confusion, their denial, it all felt wrong. They kept saying things like, he probably wandered off, or we'll find him. But I knew better. You don't just wander off after screaming like that. We split up to search the clearing, though it felt pointless. My steps were heavy as I moved through the forest, the underbrush clutching at my boots like fingers. The air was colder now, biting through my jacket and chilling me to the bone. The forest felt alive, not in the way of rustling leaves and scampering animals, but something deeper, something ancient, watching. I followed the trail of frost that had crept into the cabin last night. If you VTD, say, it snaked through the undergrowth, delicate and shimmering in the weak daylight. I didn't know why I followed it. Some terrible instinct kept pulling me forward, despite the knot tightening in my stomach with every step. The frost ended abruptly at the base of an ancient tree. Its trunk was wide and gnarled, its roots clawing at the earth like they were trying to escape. Carved into the bark were symbols, jagged, spiraling marks that made my head ache just looking at them. They were the same as those on the amulet. I reached out, my fingers trembling as they brushed against the bark. It was warm. Too warm, like the tree itself was alive, pulsing with a heartbeat, just beneath the surface. The whispers started again, soft and insidious, threading through the air around me. I staggered back, my vision blurring, and for a moment, I thought I saw something move within the tree. An outline, faint but unmistakable, shifting just beneath the bark. "Jake!" a voice called, snapping me out of my trance. It was Lisa. Her face was pale, her wide eyes darting around the clearing like she expected something to leap out at her. "We need to get back, now." She didn't explain, and I didn't ask. Something about her tone, sharp, clipped, like she was barely holding herself together, told me enough. We hurried back to the cabin, the frost crunching underfoot, the forest eerily silent around us. When we returned, the others were huddled around something on the ground. It was Mark's jacket, soaked in mud and torn down the middle. It's Tilfigama. It was Mark's jacket. No blood, no sign of a struggle. Just the jacket, discarded like an afterthought. The sight of it sent a chill down my spine. Enuville, Shell, Daud, Lorning, Sue. It felt like a message. Someone's messing with us. Chris muttered, his jaw tight as he turned the jacket over in his hands. It's got to be a sick joke. Locals, maybe. Locals don't leave this kind of message. Lisa snapped, gesturing to the frost, creeping toward the cabin. This isn't normal. Chris opened his mouth to argue, but the sound died in his throat as a low groan echoed through the forest. It wasn't the wind. It was deep and guttural, vibrating through the ground beneath our feet. We froze, eyes darting toward the tree line, where the shadows seemed to thicken and twist. And you wonder now, you will. Something was out there, watching. Hey, panic set in, and we decided to leave the clearing. We packed quickly, fumbling with zippers and straps, our breath coming in short. Panicked burst. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that shadowy figure from last night, standing there, grinning at me from the darkness. We didn't make it far. Quali. The forest wouldn't let us. It started with the path. No matter how far we walked, it seemed to loop back on itself. The same twisted trees and frost-bitten ground greeting us again and again. Then came the whispers, louder now, almost conversational, as though the forest was alive with unseen voices. They spoke in a language I couldn't understand, their tones mocking, taunting. Chris snapped first. He dropped his bag and spun around, his eyes wild, shouting at the trees. "What do you want?" he screamed, his voice cracking. "What the hell do you want from us?" The forest answered. The groan came again, deeper this time, shaking the ground and sending a flock of crows bursting into the sky. The shadows between the trees seemed to shift, coalescing into something more solid, something moving. Chris stumbled back, his bravado crumbling as a figure stepped out of the shadows. It wasn't Mark, not anymore. The thing wearing his face was wrong. Its features stretched and distorted, its eyes empty pits of darkness. It moved jerkily, like a marionette with tangled strings, its head tilting at unnatural angles as it took a step toward us. "Leave," it rasped, the voice a guttural echo that made my skin crawl. "Leave. Or stay forever." No one moved. No one breathed. Then it lunged. Chaos erupted. Chris screamed as the thing tackled him, its twisted hands clawing at his face. Lisa grabbed a branch and swung wildly, striking it across the back. It didn't flinch. I grabbed Chris' arm, pulling him free as the thing turned its hollow eyes on me. It reached out, its fingers stretching impossibly long, brushing against my shoulder before I yanked Chris to his feet and ran. We didn't stop until we reached the cabin, slamming the door shut behind us. The whispers followed, pressing against the walls like a living thing, filling the room with their insidious hum. Chris collapsed onto the floor, shaking, his face pale and streaked with dirt. Lisa paced near the door, her hands trembling as she gripped the branch like a lifeline. "We can't stay here," I said, my voice barely audible over the whispers. "Whatever that thing is, it's not going to stop." Lisa stopped pacing, her eyes locking onto mine. "Then where do we go? There's no way out. We're trapped." The realization settled over us like a weight, suffocating and inescapable. We were trapped. The forest wouldn't let us leave, and whatever was out there wasn't going to let us live. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening now, as if mocking our fear. And somewhere, just beyond the edge of the clearing, I thought I saw it again. The shadow standing still, watching, waiting. Why? The cabin felt smaller with each passing moment, the walls pressing closer as though the forest was reclaiming its territory. None of us spoke for what felt like hours, the silence stretching thin and taut, broken only by the occasional creak of the wood beneath our feet. The whispers had subsided, but they hadn't disappeared. They lingered just beyond the edges of hearing, a constant reminder that we were never truly alone. Chris sat, hunched in the corner, clutching his knees to his chest, his eyes fixed on a spot on the floor that only he could see. Lisa paced the room, her movements erratic, her breathing shallow. I stayed near the window, watching the clearing for any sign of movement. My hands shook as I gripped the splintered edge of the frame, but I couldn't let go. Something was out there, waiting, and I wasn't going to let it catch us off guard again. Then it happened. A single knock at the door. It wasn't loud, barely more than a tap, but it sent a jolt of electricity through the room. Lisa froze mid-step, her head snapping toward the sound. Chris whimpered, pressing himself further into the corner. My breath caught in my throat as I turned to face the door. It shouldn't have been possible. We were the only ones here. The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. The air in the cabin grew heavy, thick with an invisible pressure that made my ears ring. I stepped forward, my legs moving on their own, my body ignoring the screaming protests of my mind. "Don't!" Lisa hissed, her voice sharp and desperate. But it was too late. My hand was already on the doorknob. Envelop. I hesitated, my fingers trembling as I gripped the cold metal. And my heart pounded against my ribs, each beat a deafening drumbeat in my ears. I knew I shouldn't open it. Every instinct screamed at me to leave it alone, to walk away. But the knock came again. And this time, it was accompanied by a voice. "Help me," it said, low and broken, barely more than a whisper. It was Mark's voice. I froze, my blood turning to ice. It couldn't be him. We'd seen, no, felt what had happened. There was no way he could still be alive. But the voice came again, more urgent this time, and my resolve crumbled. I twisted the knob and yanked the door open. Stop. There was nothing there, just the empty clearing, bathed in the pale light of the moon. So I stepped outside, my breath misting in the cold air, and turned in a slow circle. The forest loomed around me, its shadows deep and impenetrable. And then I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the tree line. It was Mark, or at least it looked like him. His clothes were torn and dirty, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes hollow and empty. He stared at me, unmoving, his arms hanging limply at his sides. My throat tightened, and I took a hesitant step forward. "Mark," I called, my voice shaking. He didn't respond. He just stood there, staring, as though he was waiting for something. The air grew colder with each passing second, a biting chill that sank into my bones. And then he smiled. It was a slow, unnatural thing, his lips stretching too far, exposing teeth that were sharp and wrong. My stomach churned, and I stumbled back, my legs nearly giving out beneath me. The figure that was not Mark took a step forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on tangled strings. I turned and ran back to the cabin, slamming the door behind me. Lisa and Chris were on their feet, their faces pale with fear. "What happened?" Lisa demanded, her voice trembling. I couldn't answer. The words wouldn't come. I just shook my head, my breath coming in short. Panicked gasps. The whispers started again, louder this time, pressing against the walls like an unwelcome guest. The air grew thick and stifling, and the room seemed to darken, the shadows stretching and twisting like living things. Chris snapped first. He grabbed his bag and headed for the door, his movements frantic and clumsy. "I'm not staying here," he said, his voice high-pitched and shaky. "I'm not waiting around to die." Lisa tried to stop him, but he pushed past her, yanking the door open and stepping into the night. We followed, too afraid to be left behind. The forest was different now. Individualis island was. The trees seemed closer, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The path we'd taken before was gone, replaced by a twisting maze of roots and underbrush. The whispers followed us, growing louder with each step, and the air was filled with the faint scent of rot. We walked for what felt like hours, the darkness pressing in around us. Chris led the way, his flashlight cutting a narrow beam through the black. Lisa stayed close to me, her hand gripping my arm like a lifeline. None of us spoke. The only sounds were the crunch of leaves beneath our feet and the whispers, always the whispers. And then we saw it, a structure barely visible through the trees, its silhouette sharp and angular against the night sky. It was a church, or what was left of one. The roof had caved in, and the walls were cracked and covered in moss, but it stood there, defiant and foreboding. Chris didn't hesitate. He pushed open the heavy wooden doors and stepped inside, his flashlight sweeping across the ruined interior. The air was colder here, thick with an oppressive weight that made my chest ache. The whispers stopped as we entered, replaced by a silence so complete it felt deafening. The walls were covered in the same symbols I'd seen on the tree, their jagged lines seeming to writhe and twist under the flashlight's beam. At the center of the room was an altar, its surface blackened and cracked, as though it had been burned. Chris approached it, his steps slow and hesitant. Lisa and I hung back, our breaths shallow and uneven. There was something wrong here, something deeply, fundamentally wrong. Wayne, Chris reached the altar and froze. His flashlight flickered, the beam dimming and brightening as though struggling against some unseen force. What is it? I asked, my voice barely audible. He turned to us, his face pale, and his eyes wide with fear. It's the amulet, he whispered, and then the light went out. The darkness swallowed us whole. Chris' flashlight died in an instant, plunging the church into a void so absolute it felt alive. The air was suffocating, thick and heavy, carrying the faint metallic tang of blood. I reached out blindly, my fingers brushing against the cold stone wall, as the whispers crept back, louder this time, almost taunting. Chris, I called, my voice trembling. Enundri falair, up till, undimmed soul. It felt like shouting into a void. Lisa, Gaon, dat deund, eleda, etan, tu, dat trifdal. No answer. Just the whispers, threading through the silence like a sinister melody. My pulse hammered in my ears, every instinct screaming at me to run. But I didn't know which way to go. The space felt wrong, larger than it should have been, as though the walls had stretched outward into infinity. A sharp cry cut through the dark, a sound so raw and primal that it froze me in place. It was Chris. The noise twisted into something unrecognizable, a gurgling, choked gasp that echoed in the vast emptiness. Then, silence. Chris. Lisa's voice cracked. Somewhere to my left. I turned, fumbling for her, but my hands found only empty air. The ground beneath my feet felt uneven, shifting as though the earth itself was alive. Faint glow appeared in the distance, flickering like a dying ember. It pulsed, weak at first, then brighter, illuminating the altar in a sickly greenish light. I stumbled toward it, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The amulet was there, resting in the center of the cracked stone, its surface glowing faintly. The symbols on its edges seemed to shift and writhe, as though they were alive. Lisa, Kenon, Kai. I called again, louder this time. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, their tones rising and falling like a demented chant. I reached the altar, and grabbed the amulet without thinking. The moment my fingers touched it, the glow flared, blinding and searing, burning through my skin like fire. I screamed, falling to my knees as pain lanced up my arm. Annie, the whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the walls. The ground trembled beneath me, and a crack split the stone floor, spreading outward like a web. From somewhere deep below, a sound emerged, a deep, rhythmic thud, like the beating of an enormous heart. Jake! Lisa's voice was closer now, desperate and frantic. I turned to see her stumbling toward me, her face pale and streaked with tears. Behind her, the shadows moved, twisting and coiling like living things. Shapes began to emerge, twisted, unnatural forms with too many limbs and hollow, featureless faces. Run, I shouted, the word tearing from my throat as I scrambled to my feet. The amulet was still clutched in my hand, its heat searing into my palm. Lisa reached me just as the first of the shapes lunged, its elongated arms reaching for her with a fluid, boneless motion. I grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the door. The shadows surged forward, their movements erratic and unnatural, like puppets on strings. We ran, the air around us growing colder with each step, the walls of the church twisting and warping as though the building itself was alive. The door loomed ahead, its surface splintered and rotting. We reached it together, slamming into it with all our weight. It burst open, and we tumbled outside into the forest. The cold air hit me like a slap, sharp and biting, but I didn't stop. I pulled Lisa to her feet, and we ran, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. The forest was alive with sound now, a cacophony of growls, whispers, and the rustling of leaves. The path twisted beneath our feet, pulling us deeper into the woods. Pelly, it didn't make sense, no matter which way we turned. The trees closed in, their branches clawing at us like skeletal hands. "Where's Chris?" Lisa gasped, her voice barely audible over the noise. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I didn't have the heart to tell her what I already knew. We stumbled into a clearing, the ground beneath us slick with mud. In the center stood another tree, ancient and gnarled, its bark covered in the same shifting symbols as the amulet. The air here was colder, heavier, pressing down on me like a weight. "What is this?" Lisa whispered, her voice trembling. And the tree seemed to pulse, its roots writhing beneath the soil like living things. The whispers returned, louder now, a cacophony of voices overlapping and drowning out my thoughts. The amulet in my hand began to glow again, its light casting eerie shadows across the clearing. The ground beneath us trembled, and the tree split open with a deafening crack, revealing a hollow darkness within. From that darkness, something began to emerge. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The figure that stepped out was tall, impossibly thin, its form flickering and shifting like a flame. Its face, or what passed for one, was featureless, a void that seemed to pull the light from the air around it. It raised a hand, long and spindly, and pointed at me. The whispers stopped. Ellen. The silence was deafening, crushing, a weight that pressed against my chest and stole the air from my lungs. The figure took a step forward, and the amulet burned brighter, the symbols on its surface glowing with a furious intensity. My head throbbed, a sharp, searing pain that made my vision blur. "Jake," Lisa said, her voice small and fragile. "What do we do?" I didn't have an answer. The figure was coming closer, its movements slow and deliberate, each step accompanied by the faint sound of cracking wood. I tightened my grip on the amulet, the pain in my hand a dull throb compared to the terror flooding my veins. The ground beneath us began to crack, the fissures spreading outward from the tree. The forest around us seemed to recoil, the shadows retreating as the figure stepped closer. It reached out, its hand inches from my chest, and the whispers returned louder than ever, a deafening roar that filled my mind. And then everything went white. The light faded slowly, leaving me dazed and gasping for air. My vision swam as the forest around us reappeared, its oppressive darkness creeping back in like a living thing. The figure was gone, or maybe it was never truly there. But the tree remained, its gnarled branches reaching skyward like jagged claws. The amulet in my hand was ice cold now, its glow extinguished, though the faint patterns still crawled across its surface, etched into my memory like a brand. Lisa was on her knees beside me, her face pale and streaked with dirt. She clutched her chest, her breaths shallow and ragged. What just happened?" she stammered, her voice barely audible. I didn't have an answer. My mind was a mess, fragments of what I'd seen, what I'd felt, flashing through my thoughts like shards of broken glass. The whispers had stopped, but their echo lingered, threading through my nerves like an aftershock. The air felt wrong, thick and stifling, as though the forest itself had been holding its breath. "We need to move," I managed to say, my voice hoarse. The sound of my own words felt foreign, detached, like they didn't belong to me. Lisa nodded weakly, and I helped her to her feet. The forest seemed different now, its shadows deeper, its silence heavier. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. They were tags and into. The path before us twisted and shifted, as if the forest was rearranging itself, leading us somewhere. Every step felt heavier than the last, the weight of the amulet in my hand growing unbearable. Lisa stayed close, her eyes darting to every shadow, every flicker of movement. Neither of us spoke. Words felt dangerous here, like they might draw the attention of whatever was lurking just out of sight. We came to a clearing, unlike any we'd seen before. The ground was bare, the trees around it scorched and blackened, their branches brittle and lifeless. At the center stood another structure, An ancient stone monolith, covered in the same symbols as the amulet and the tree. It was taller than I expected, its surface cracked and weathered, but it radiated a presence that made my skin crawl. The whispers returned, faint at first, then louder, more insistent. They didn't come from the forest this time. They came from the monolith. The air vibrated with their intensity, a low, resonant hum that made my teeth ache. I stepped closer, drawn to it despite the screaming protests of my instincts. The amulet in my hand grew warm, the patterns on its surface beginning to glow faintly once more. "This isn't right," Lisa whispered, her voice trembling. "We shouldn't be here." I knew she was right, but I couldn't stop. The monolith seemed to pull at me, an invisible force tugging at my mind. My body, my very soul. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the cold, rough stone. The whispers surged, a deafening cacophony that made me stagger back. And then I saw it. The surface of the monolith rippled like water, and an image began to take shape. A twisted, nightmarish vision that made my blood cold. I saw the forest, alive and writhing, its trees bending and twisting as if in agony. I saw faces, pale and hollow-eyed, emerging from the bark, their mouths open in silent screams. And at the center of it all was a figure, taller than the trees, its form shifting and indistinct. A void that seemed to consume the very fabric of reality. The image vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving me gasping and trembling. Lisa was beside me, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. "What did you see?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Something ancient," I said, struggling to find the words. "It's not just in the forest. It is the forest. And it's waking up." Lisa took a step back, shaking her head. No. This can't be real. This can't be happening." But it was. The ground beneath us trembled, and the air grew colder, biting and sharp. The monolith began to glow, its symbols flaring to life in a sickly, greenish light. The whispers rose to a crescendo, and the forest around us seemed to come alive, the trees groaning and creaking as if in protest. "We have to leave," I said, grabbing Lisa's arm. "Eerie." "No, Binti." We turned and ran, the forest closing in around us, the whispers chasing us like a predator. The path twisted and shifted beneath our feet, the trees reaching out with gnarled branches that seemed to grasp at us. I could feel the presence of the thing in the forest, its gaze heavy and unrelenting, pressing down on me with a weight that threatened to crush me. We stumbled into another clearing, this one smaller and more enclosed. The ground was uneven, covered in roots that jutted out like the ribs of some long-dead creature. At the center was a small stone altar, cracked and weathered, but unmistakably ancient. The amulet in my hand pulsed, its glow growing brighter as we approached. "What is this?" Lisa asked, her voice barely audible over the whispers. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The altar seemed to hum with energy, a low, resonant vibration that matched the rhythm of my own heartbeat. The amulet grew impossibly hot, searing into my palm. I dropped it onto the altar, and the moment it touched the stone, the forest fell silent. The whispers stopped. The wind died. Even the trees seemed to hold still, their branches frozen in mid-reach. And then, from the silence, came a sound, a low guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The ground beneath us cracked, and from the altar, a thin, black smoke began to rise, twisting and coiling like a living thing. Lisa grabbed my arm, her grip tight and desperate. "What did you do?" she whispered, her voice filled with terror. The smoke rose higher, forming a shape, a figure, tall and thin, its edges flickering like flame. Its face was a void, a hollow absence that drew my gaze and refused to let go. It raised an arm, pointing directly at me, and the whispers returned, louder than ever, a deafening roar that filled my mind. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. All I could do was stare as the figure stepped closer, its presence filling the clearing, the forest, the world, and then everything went black. When I came to, the world felt wrong, tilted, stretched, as though reality had been torn apart and hastily stitched back together. My head throbbed, each heartbeat sending a sharp pain through my skull. The air was stifling, heavy with the scent of ash, and something sickly sweet that made my stomach churn. For a moment, I couldn't move. My limbs weighed down as though the ground itself was holding me in place. "Lisa, tranquil, Edinone, guides aware." My voice cracked, dry and raw. The sound barely rose above a whisper, swallowed by the oppressive silence. I forced myself upright, my vision swimming as I took in my surroundings. The clearing was gone, replaced by a landscape that defied logic. The trees were still there, but they were warped, their trunks bent at impossible angles, their branches curling inward like claws. The ground beneath me pulsed faintly, as though it had a heartbeat of its own. And the sky was wrong. It was dark, not with the absence of light, but with a thick, swirling blackness that seemed to press down from above. "Lisa, lay, soon and shui, and Lisa." I tried again, louder this time. Panic clawed at my chest as I scanned the distorted forest for any sign of her. My legs felt unsteady as I stumbled forward, the terrain shifting beneath my feet. The whispers were back, faint and distant, but growing louder with each step, as if they were leading me somewhere. I didn't know how long I walked. Time felt meaningless here. The oppressive atmosphere, turning every second into an eternity. The shadows moved in the corners of my vision, flickering shapes that vanished the moment I turned to look. The further I went, the stronger the whispers became, their cadence rhythmic and insidious, drilling into my thoughts like a melody I couldn't shake. And I saw her. feeling too. Lisa was standing in the middle of another clearing, her back to me, her figure illuminated by an otherworldly glow. The light came from the altar, though it was no longer cracked and weathered. It pulsed with a vibrant energy, its surface smooth and polished, the symbols etched into it glowing with an eerie green light. Lisa. Relief flooded me, and I rushed forward, but she didn't respond. She stood perfectly still, her arms at her sides, her head tilted slightly upward as though she was staring at something in the sky. My steps faltered as I drew closer, a cold dread settling in my stomach. Her lips were moving. I couldn't hear what she was saying over the whispers, but her words were steady, deliberate, as if she were reciting something. The closer I got, the stronger the whispers became, until they weren't just sounds anymore. They were voices, thousands of them, overlapping and chaotic, each one clawing at the edges of my sanity. I reached out, my hand trembling as I touched her shoulder. Lisa, stop. Whatever you're doing, stop. She turned to me slowly, her movements stiff and unnatural. Her eyes met mine, and my breath caught in my throat. They weren't her eyes anymore. They used to, but they vivid. They were black, endless voids that reflected nothing, swallowing the dim light around us. Her lips curled into a faint smile, but it wasn't hers. It was something else, something that wore her face like a mask. So say, enemy, could tea, can feel power, or Jake, she said, her voice layered, as though two people were speaking at once. It's too late. A sound like a thunderclap shattered the air, and the ground beneath us cracked, glowing fissures spreading outward from the altar. The trees around the clearing twisted violently, their branches snapping and splintering as the air filled with a deafening roar. I stumbled back, the force of it knocking me off my feet. From the altar, a shape began to rise. It was formless at first, a swirling mass of shadow and light. But it quickly took shape, an impossibly tall figure, its limbs long and thin, its body a tangle of jagged edges that seemed to shift and blur as it moved. Its face was nothing more than a void, a gaping absence that drew my gaze and refused to let go. The whispers became screams, a cacophony of sound that tore through my mind like a knife. The figure turned toward me, its hollow face locking onto mine. My body refused to move, every muscle frozen in place. As it reached out, its hand impossibly large and clawed, dripping with an inky black substance that hissed as it touched the ground. Lisa stepped forward, placing herself between me and the figure. Her movements were calm, almost serene, as though she were under its control. "It's calling," she said, her voice unnervingly calm. "It needs you." I shook my head, my voice trembling as I forced the words out. "No. Lisa, we can fight this. We can stop it." Her smile widened, and for a moment I thought I saw something, her real self, flicker behind those empty eyes. "It doesn't want to be stopped," she whispered. The figure moved then, its hand closing around the altar. The ground shook violently, and I felt myself being pulled toward it, an invisible force dragging me closer. My grip on the earth failed, and I slid toward the glowing fissures, the heat searing my skin as I struggled to hold on. Lisa stood still, watching as I fought against the pull. "It's already here," she said, her voice barely audible over the roar. "You can't stop it." Desperation fueled me as I reached for her, my hand outstretched. "Lisa, please, fight it." For a moment, she hesitated. Her expression shifted, her features softening, and I saw a glimmer of recognition in her eyes. But then the figure moved again, and whatever part of her was still there disappeared, swallowed by the void. The last thing I saw before the light consumed everything was her face, her smile fading. As the figure reached for me, the world dissolved into blinding light, its intensity pressing against my eyelids and burning through my mind. I tried to scream, but no sound came. My body felt weightless, suspended in a void where time and space no longer mattered. The air around me hummed with energy, a pulsating rhythm that matched the pounding of my heart. And then, with a violent lurch, the light shattered. I fell hard, the impact forcing the air from my lungs as jagged rocks bit into my back. The ground beneath me was cold and uneven, its texture rough and unforgiving. I opened my eyes slowly, wincing, as the dim glow of the fractured sky came into view. The forest was gone, or at least the forest I knew. This place was something else, a warped, impossible version of reality where the ground pulsed faintly with a sickly green light, and the trees stretched unnaturally high, their branches spiraling into the sky like tendrils of smoke. The whispers were louder now, clearer, weaving into my thoughts with a familiarity that made my skin crawl. "Jake, bitched." The voice was soft, almost tender, but it didn't belong to Lisa. It came from everywhere and nowhere, a phantom sound that seemed to wrap around me like a shroud. I forced myself to my feet, my legs trembling beneath me. The air was cold, biting against my skin, yet I was drenched in sweat. Ahead of me, the monolith loomed, its surface glowing faintly with the same shifting symbols as before. But now, it was different, taller, more alive. Lisa. "Eden," I called out, my voice echoing in the emptiness. There was no answer, only the faint rustling of leaves that didn't move, the sound wrong in ways I couldn't explain. I staggered toward the monolith, drawn by a force I couldn't resist, each step heavier than the last. As I approached, a shape emerged from the shadows, a figure standing motionless at the base of the monolith. My breath caught in my throat as recognition dawned. It was Lisa. Erul, da. She stood with her back to me, her arms limp at her sides, her head tilted upward as if in silent reverence. The green light of the monolith bathed her in an unnatural glow, casting jagged shadows across her form. "Lisa," I said, my voice cracking. I took a cautious step forward, my instinct screaming at me to stop, to turn back. But I couldn't. It's me. I'm here. She turned slowly, her movements deliberate and inhuman. Her face was pale, her features stretched and drawn, as though something had tried to reshape her into a mockery of herself. Her eyes, no longer voids, but glowing, pulsating orbs of green light, locked onto mine. For a moment, the whispers seemed quiet, replaced by a low, rhythmic hum that reverberated through my chest. You shouldn't have come here, she said, her voice layered, a chorus of tones that grated against my ears. It doesn't want you. It needs you. What does that mean? I demanded, my voice rising despite the weight pressing against my chest. Lisa, fight this. Come back to me. Her lips curled into a sad smile. There is no coming back. Not for me. Not for any of us. The ground beneath her feet began to crack, glowing fissures, spreading outward in jagged lines. The monolith pulsed with a blinding light, and I shielded my eyes as the hum grew louder, a deafening roar that seemed to shake the very air. And then it appeared. The figure that had haunted the edges of my vision finally stepped into full view. It towered over the monolith, its form both solid and shifting, a mass of shadow and light that seemed to consume the space around it. Its limbs were impossibly long, its edges jagged and sharp, and its face, or lack thereof, was a void that pulled at me, drawing me closer with every passing second. Lisa stepped aside, her movements fluid and alien, as though she were merely a puppet. The figure turned toward me, its presence overwhelming, pressing down on me with a weight that stole the air from my lungs. The whispers returned, louder now, their voices clear and sharp. They spoke in a language I couldn't understand, yet the meaning was unmistakable. Submit. Become. Be. End. Bent. I stumbled back, my hand instinctively reaching for the amulet that still hung around my neck. It burned against my skin, its glow faint but steady, a tiny beacon of resistance against the overwhelming darkness. I gripped it tightly, the pain grounding me as I faced the figure. What do you want from me? I shouted, my voice cracking under the strain. The figure tilted its head, a motion so unnatural it made my stomach churn. The whispers swirled around me, their intensity rising until they drowned out my thoughts. And then it spoke. Its voice wasn't a sound, but a feeling. A deep vibration that resonated in my bones. You are the key. You are the end. Shh. The ground beneath me cracked, and I fell to my knees, the amulet growing hotter in my hand. Images flooded my mind, flashes of the forest, the monolith, the altar, and finally Lisa's face, twisted and distorted by something I couldn't comprehend. No, I screamed, the word tearing from my throat as I fought against the force pulling at me. The amulet flared to life, its light cutting through the darkness, and for a brief moment the whispers faltered. Lisa's expression shifted, her glowing eyes dimming as someone flickered beneath the surface. "Jake," she whispered, her voice her own again, soft and fragile. "You have to stop it." "How?" I asked, desperation clawing at me. Her gaze dropped to the amulet. "You already know." The figure roared, its form distorting as it lunged toward me. The ground shook violently, and the air was filled with the sound of shattering stone. I clutched the amulet, its heat searing into my palm as I raised it high. The whispers rose to a crescendo, a deafening scream that threatened to tear me apart. With all my strength, I drove the amulet into the ground, its light exploding outward in a blinding wave. The figure recoiled, its form fracturing and splintering as the light consumed it. Lisa's face was the last thing I saw before the world dissolved into white. The air was colder near the sinkhole, colder than it should have been. It wasn't the crisp, clean chill of autumn that I'd grown up with. This was different, heavy, oppressive, and wet, like the breath of something waiting just below the surface. I stood at the edge of the crater, staring down into the blackness that seemed to swallow the light. The trees around me whispered, their branches swaying in a breeze I couldn't feel. I shouldn't have been there. It was late, and the forest was the kind of dark that made you forget the sky could hold stars. But something had drawn me here, something in the back of my mind that I couldn't quite shake, like a voice I didn't want to admit I'd heard. It was the same voice that had been keeping me awake at night, the same one that had echoed in my dreams. I didn't want to believe it, but it sounded like Mia. The sinkhole wasn't natural. That much was obvious. The earth had given way suddenly, leaving a perfect circle of destruction. The edges were jagged, like something had clawed its way out. It had appeared 2 days ago, unannounced and unwelcome, right in the middle of the Havenwood forest. At first, it was just another curiosity for the town, a weird phenomenon to gossip about over coffee. But then, the noises started. I'd heard them myself, standing exactly where I was now, just before sunset yesterday. A low hum, almost too deep to hear, followed by a faint whispering that came from everywhere at once. It wasn't the kind of sound you could explain away as wind or animals. It was deliberate, intentional. And it hadn't stopped since. I'd tried to talk to Mia about it that morning, hoping she'd tell me I was being ridiculous. But she hadn't answered her phone. No one had seen her since last night. I wanted to believe she'd just taken off for a few hours, maybe gone for one of her long, brooding walks to clear her head. But Mia never ignored my calls, not even when she was mad at me. The journal was the first real clue that something was wrong. I found it on her desk when I let myself into her apartment. Mia wasn't one to leave things out of place, but the leather-bound book sat there like it was waiting for me. The pages were filled with her tight, looping handwriting, but it wasn't the kind of thing she'd usually write. Mia didn't believe in the supernatural. She'd always rolled her eyes at ghost stories and campfire legends, but these pages were filled with sketches of symbols I didn't recognize and frantic notes about the voices and the darkness below. One entry, near the end, had been underlined so many times. The ink had bled through the paper. "It's awake." Now I was standing where the journal said she'd been, my heart pounding harder than I wanted to admit. The sinkhole stretched out in front of me, its edges lined with collapsed dirt and tangled roots. I shone my flashlight into the void, but the beam didn't reach the bottom. "I'm doing as if you were there." It just kept going, swallowed by the blackness. The hum started again, faint but steady. It felt like it was coming from the ground beneath my feet, vibrating through my boots and into my bones. I took a step back, instinctively, as if the earth might open up and take me with it. That's when I saw it. A shadow moved near the edge of the sinkhole. Quick, almost imperceptible. My breath caught, and I swung the flashlight toward it, but there was nothing there. Just trees, their skeletal branches swaying in that non-existent wind. I told myself it was nothing, just a trick of the light or my own nerves getting the better of me. But I didn't believe it. The whispering followed, soft at first, barely audible over the hum. It wasn't like the wind or the sound of the trees. It was language, though I couldn't understand it. Words I'd never heard before, spoken in a voice that wasn't quite human. I wanted to run, to turn, and get as far away from that place as I could. But I stayed, rooted to the spot, unable to tear my eyes away from the darkness. Something glinted near the edge of the sinkhole. A faint shimmer of light that caught the corner of my vision. I stepped closer, my hands trembling as I aimed a flashlight at the spot. A metallic object lay half buried in the dirt, its surface etched with strange, looping symbols. I crouched down, brushing the dirt away with my fingertips, and felt a cold shiver run up my spine. It was a pendant, heavy and intricate, with a chain that looked far too delicate to have survived being buried. The symbols on its surface seemed to shift under the light, twisting into shapes that hurt to look at. I didn't want to touch it, but I couldn't stop myself. My fingers closed around the metal, and the hum stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. The trees stopped whispering. The wind stopped moving. Even the distant sound of the town seemed to vanish, leaving nothing but the heavy weight of the air around me. Then, from the depths of the sinkhole, came a sound I will never forget. A scream. It was raw, primal, and impossibly loud, rising from the blackness with a force that shook the ground beneath my feet. My legs gave out, and I fell to my knees, clutching the pendant so tightly It cut into my paw. The scream didn't stop. It just kept going, filling the air with a sound that didn't belong in this world. When it finally faded, I was shaking so hard I could barely hold the flashlight. I stumbled to my feet, the pendant still clutched in my hand, and turned to run. But the moment I did, I saw something that froze me in place. Mia was standing at the edge of the trees. All through Sabdi, it do two mistakes, or at least it looked like Mia. Annualuvial Mia. Her head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and her eyes were wrong. They glowed faintly in the dark, reflecting the beam of my flashlight like an animal's. She didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel her watching me. I took a step back, the pendant burning cold against my skin. She took a step forward, and then the hum started again. The hum grew louder, a pulsing rhythm that seemed to vibrate through my chest. Mia, or whatever was wearing her face, took another step toward me. The light from my flashlight flickered, the beam shrinking and dimming, as though the darkness around her was swallowing it whole. My mind screamed at me to move, to run, but my body felt locked in place, trapped in the cold grip of her gaze. The pendant in my hand pulsed, the metal so cold, it felt like it might shatter. My fingers tightened around it instinctively, the sharp edges digging into my palm. The symbols carved into its surface glowed faintly, casting a pale greenish light that barely illuminated the space around me. Mia froze mid-step, her head tilting sharply, almost mechanically, as if she were listening to something I couldn't hear. Then she smiled. It wasn't her smile. It was too wide, too sharp, splitting her face in a way that made my stomach twist. Her lips moved, but the words she spoke weren't hers. They were low and guttural, like the growl of some ancient thing forcing its way through her throat. I couldn't understand them, but I felt them. Sharp, jagged sounds that tore through my thoughts like glass. The flashlight slipped from my hand, landing with a dull thud on the ground. The beam flickered once, twice, and then went out completely, plunging the forest into darkness. The only light came from the pendant, its glow flickering like a dying ember. The hum became a roar, drowning out the sound of my own breathing, and Mia took another step forward. I ran. The pendant's glow bobbed erratically as I stumbled through the trees, my legs heavy and uncooperative. Branches tore at my clothes, sharp twigs slicing into my skin as I pushed forward blindly. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat a frantic drumbeat, driving me further into the suffocating dark. Behind me, the hum rose to a deafening pitch, and the whispers started again, closer this time, louder. They weren't just in my head anymore. Shivers, itchy. They were all around me, overlapping voices that hissed and snarled, calling my name with a familiarity that made my skin crawl. The ground beneath my feet seemed to shift and ripple, as though the forest itself was alive, working against me. I broke through the tree line and into the small clearing that surrounded the sinkhole. The sight of it stopped me dead in my tracks. Envelop as the edges of the crater glowed faintly, the same greenish hue as the pendant, casting eerie shadows across the barren ground. And from the depths of the blackness below, something moved. It wasn't fast. It didn't need to be. The movement was slow and deliberate, like a predator toying with its prey. A shadow emerged, long and spindly, its form undefined but unmistakably raw. It rose from the darkness like smoke, coiling and twisting as it climbed upward, growing taller and more solid with each passing second. My legs refused to move. The pendant in my hand flared brightly, its light cutting through the haze, and the shadow recoiled slightly, as though the glow was painful. But it didn't stop. It kept rising, its shape shifting and bending, an ever-changing mass of limbs and faces that should have been there. "Mia," I whispered, my voice trembling. I wasn't sure why I said it. Maybe some part of me still thought she could hear me, that she was still in there somewhere. But the figure in the trees didn't respond. It just stood there, watching, its head tilted at that unnatural angle. The shadow lunged. I stumbled backward, falling hard against the cold earth. Fumes and SDK. The pendant's light surged, burning through the dark like a beacon, and the shadow faltered, its form breaking apart like smoke caught in a windstorm. The whispers screamed in protest, a sound so sharp and grating, it felt like nails dragging across my brain. I scrambled to my feet, clutching the pendant tightly as I backed away from the sinkhole. The shadow retreated slightly, its shape flickering and unstable, but it didn't disappear. It hovered at the edge of the crater, just out of reach, its many faces turning toward me with expressions that were almost human. Almost. The hum began to fade, replaced by a deep, rhythmic thudding sound that seemed to come from the sinkhole itself. The ground trembled beneath my feet, and I staggered, nearly losing my balance. The pendant pulsed in my hand, the glow growing dimmer with each pulse, as if its energy was being drained. I turned and ran, my legs trembling beneath me, as I fled toward the faint glimmer of the town's streetlights in the distance. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees leaning inward as if trying to keep me from escaping. The whispers followed, softer now, but still present, a constant reminder that I wasn't alone. When I finally broke free of the woods, my chest was heaving, and my limbs felt like lead. The town was quiet, its streets empty, and bathed in the dim orange glow of the street lamps. I stumbled toward the nearest house, the pendant still clutched tightly in my hand. The glow had faded completely, leaving only the faint, icy chill of the metal against my skin. I collapsed onto the porch steps, my hands trembling as I tried to catch my breath. The whispers had stopped, but their echoes lingered in my mind, a constant reminder of what I'd seen, of what was still out there. You vital arms elebrical. And then, just as the silence began to feel safe, I heard it again. The hum. The ha. believe. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there, vibrating through the ground beneath me. I looked down at the pendant in my hand, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw the symbols begin to shift again. Right. The hum grew louder, and this time, it wasn't coming from the forest. The hum didn't stop. Restful. It was subtle at first, like a faint vibration in the soles of my feet, barely noticeable over the pounding of my pulse. But as I sat there on the porch, clutching the pendant like it was the only thing keeping me tethered to reality, the sound grew louder, stronger, strummed. It felt as though the ground itself was alive, thrumming with an energy that had no place in the quiet of Havenwood. The pendant in my hand began to warm, the once icy metal now pulsing against my palm. I stared at it, the symbols etched into its surface, shifting ever so slightly, like ripples in a still pond disturbed by an unseen force. My breath caught in my throat as the glow returned, faint but unmistakable, casting pale green light across my trembling hands. I forced myself to stand, my legs unsteady beneath me. The hum wasn't just in the ground anymore. It was in the air, vibrating through my chest, my skull, my very thoughts. I stumbled off the porch, my eyes scanning the empty street for any sign of life. But the town seemed frozen in time. Every window was dark, every shadow too deep. Even the street lamps felt dimmer, their orange glow struggling to penetrate the gloom. The sound was pulling me. I didn't want to follow it, but my feet moved on their own, dragging me back toward the forest. My mind screamed at me to stop, to turn around, to find someone, anyone, and tell them what was happening. But the pull was stronger than fear, stronger than logic. It wasn't just drawing me in, it was commanding me. As I crossed the threshold of the trees, the hum shifted, morphing into something more complex. It was no longer a single note, but a symphony of sounds layered atop one another. Whispers, screams, and something else, something I couldn't name. The pendant grew warmer still, its glow intensifying with every step I took. The light didn't illuminate the path ahead. It seemed to sink into the shadows, swallowed by the unnatural darkness. The sinkhole came into view, its edges glowing faintly, pulsing in time with the sound. The air here was heavier, pressing against my chest like a physical weight. The forest around the crater was utterly still, the trees standing in solemn silence, as though they were witnesses to something ancient and forbidden. I stopped at the edge, staring down into the abyss. And it's time. The blackness seemed alive, shifting and swirling like a living thing. And the sound was deafening now, a cacophony that drowned out everything else. The pendant in my hand burned like fire, but I couldn't let go. Its light flared, reflecting off the surface of the crater and revealing something I hadn't seen before. Symbols. They were carved into the walls of the sinkhole, etched deep into the earth like scars. They were the same as the ones on the pendant, the same as the ones in Mia's journal, and they glowed with the same eerie light. The sight of them made my head throb, a sharp, stabbing pain that blurred my vision and sent me stumbling backward. A sound broke through the noise. A voice, distant but distinct, rising from the depths of the crater. It wasn't Mia's voice. Tranquil, the fruitus, Eliobedo ghost. It wasn't even human. It was deep and resonant, layered with tones that made my skin crawl. The words were incomprehensible, but the intent was clear. It was calling to me. I should have run. Every instinct I had screamed at me to leave, to turn around and never look back, but I didn't. Instead, I stepped closer, drawn by a force I couldn't fight. The pendant's glow grew blinding, and the hum reached a fever pitch, shaking the ground beneath my feet. And then the earth gave way. I fell, the world spinning around me as the sinkhole swallowed me whole. The air rushed past, cold and sharp, tearing at my clothes and skin. My scream was lost in the roar of the wind, and for a moment I thought this was it. This was how it ended. But the fall wasn't endless. Endless. I hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the air from my lungs and sending pain shooting through my body. I lay there for what felt like an eternity, gasping for breath, the sound of the hum still ringing in my ears. The pendant had gone dark, its light extinguished, but the symbols on its surface still seemed to move, writhing like living things. The air down here was thick, heavy with the scent of earth and something else, something metallic and sickly sweet. I forced myself to sit up, my vision blurry, but slowly clearing. The walls of the cavern were close, covered in the same glowing symbols I'd seen above. The ground beneath me was uneven, jagged and cold, and the darkness around me felt alive. And then I saw them. Shapes moved in the shadows, shifting at the edges of the faint light cast by the glowing symbols. They weren't solid, not entirely. They flickered and wavered, their forms indistinct but unmistakably wrong. Too many limbs. Elumis haul. Too many eyes. Too many things that shouldn't have been there. The whispers returned, louder than before, weaving through the air like threads of venom. They weren't just outside me anymore. They were in my head, seeping into my thoughts, twisting them into something I didn't recognize. I clutched the pendant tightly, its cool metal grounding me as I fought to hold on to myself. A voice rose above the whispers, clear and commanding, and I turned toward its source. At the far end of the cavern, something loomed. A figure, impossibly tall and shrouded in darkness. Its form was fluid, constantly shifting, but its presence was overwhelming. It radiated power, a force so strong it made my knees buckle. It took a step forward, and the ground trembled beneath me. The whispers grew frantic, rising to a deafening pitch as the figure extended a hand, long and spindly, toward me. The symbols on the walls flared brightly, their glow matching the rhythm of the hum, and the pendant in my hand began to pulse once more. The figure stopped, its head tilting as though it was studying me. Its presence was suffocating, pressing against my mind with an intensity that made my vision blur. And then, without warning, it spoke. "You are the key." The words reverberated through me, a deep, resonant sound that wasn't just heard. It was felt. The whispers fell silent, and the cavern seemed to hold its breath as the figure stepped closer, its form towering over me. I tightened my grip on the pendant, its light flaring in response. The figure recoiled slightly, its form flickering and unstable, and, for the first time, I felt something other than fear. I felt hope. The figure loomed over me, its form both there and not there, a shifting mass of shadow and light that seemed to defy the laws of the world. The cavern pulsed with an energy I could feel in my chest, a rhythmic beat that made my breath hitch with every thrum. The pendant in my hand burned brighter, its glow piercing the oppressive darkness. But it wasn't enough to banish the figure. It only seemed to agitate it. Its head tilted again, a slow, deliberate motion that made my stomach churn. The void where its face should have been pulled at me, not physically, but with a force I couldn't explain, as though it were trying to draw me into its nothingness. The words it had spoken echoed in my mind, impossible to ignore. "You are the key." My knees shook, and I fought the urge to collapse. The weight of its presence was unbearable, but something inside me refused to give in. I tightened my grip on the pendant, its pulsing light steadying me, giving me a focus. My voice was weak, trembling as I forced the words out. "What do you want from me?" The cavern fell silent. Even the whispers seemed to hold their breath. The figure didn't respond at first, its shifting form rippling as it seemed to consider my question. And then it moved, not closer this time, but sideways, gliding effortlessly across the cavern floor. It stopped beside one of the glowing walls, its hand, a jagged, impossibly long thing, hovering over the symbols etched into the rock. The light of the symbols flared, their glow intensifying until the patterns began to move. They twisted and turned, rearranging themselves into shapes and lines that didn't make sense, but somehow felt deliberate. My head throbbed, the shifting patterns sending sharp, stabbing pain through my temples, and I had to look away. When I glanced back, the figure was pointing at something in the symbols, a shape, circular and intricate, with jagged lines spiraling outward like the arms of a broken clock. The same shape was carved into the pendant, its edges now glowing with the same eerie green light. My chest tightened as realization dawned. It wasn't just showing me the symbol, it was activating something. The ground beneath me trembled, a low, rumbling vibration that grew stronger with each passing second. Cracks formed in the cavern walls, spidering out from the glowing symbols, and a sound like distant thunder echoed through the air. The figure turned back to me, its form flickering and unstable, and though it had no eyes, I could feel its gaze. The whispers returned, louder now, overlapping voices that spilled into my mind and twisted my thoughts. They weren't calling my name anymore. They were chanting something, a word I didn't understand, but felt in my bones. I staggered backward, my heart hammering against my ribs, as the cavern seemed to close in around me. The rumbling grew louder, and the cracks in the walls widened. The air filled with a metallic tang, sharp and overwhelming, as a black, viscous substance began to seep from the fissures. It moved unnaturally, snaking across the ground in tendrils that pulsed in time with the hum. The figure stepped back, almost as if it were retreating, and the sight of it sent a cold spike of fear through me. The pendant flared again, its light cutting through the darkness like a blade. The tendrils recoiled, hissing as they withdrew, and the whispers faltered, their chant breaking apart into incoherent fragments. For a brief, fleeting moment, I felt like I was winning, and then it changed. The cavern shifted, the walls bending inward as though the space itself was collapsing. The black substance surged forward, coiling around my legs and dragging me to the ground. I screamed, clawing at the floor as the tendrils tightened, their cold, slimy texture making my skin crawl. The pendant's light dimmed, flickering like a dying flame, and I felt the cold seep into my bones. The figure stepped closer again, its form towering over me as the whispers rose to a deafening pitch. My vision blurred, the edges of the world dissolving into shadows, and for a moment I thought I was lost. But then, through the chaos, I heard it, a voice. Voice, familiar, but faint. Get up. It wasn't a whisper. It wasn't a chant. It was clear, strong, and undeniably human. It cut through the noise like a beacon, grounding me in the reality I was so close to losing. My fingers found the pendant, its surface cool but steady, and I held it tightly as I forced myself to my knees. The tendrils writhed, their grip loosening as the light from the pendant grew stronger. The whispers faltered, their rhythm breaking, and the figure recoiled, its form flickering like a candle in the wind. I didn't understand what was happening, but I didn't care. I wasn't going to let it take me. Tutorial best, take me. I stood, the pendant burning in my hand, its light casting long shadows across the cavern. The tendrils hissed and withdrew, and the black substance retreated into the cracks in the walls. The figure didn't move, its form unstable and flickering, as though it was struggling to hold itself together. The light from the pendant flared once more, a blinding burst that filled the cavern. The walls trembled, the cracks widening as the symbols on their surface shattered into fragments of glowing green light. The whispers stopped abruptly, and for a moment there was nothing but silence. The figure dissolved, its form collapsing into a swirl of shadow that was swallowed by the darkness. The cavern groaned, the ground beneath me trembling as the walls began to collapse. I turned and ran, my legs screaming in protest as I pushed myself forward, the pendant's light guiding my way. The air was filled with the sound of falling rock, and cracking stone, the cavern closing in around me as I scrambled toward the faint glimmer of an opening ahead. My breath came in ragged gasps, the weight of the pendant pulling at my neck, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. I reached the opening just as the ground gave way beneath me. I lunged forward, my hands finding purchase on the jagged edge, and hauled myself up onto solid ground. The cavern collapsed behind me, a deafening roar that echoed through the earth, and I lay there, gasping for air, the pendant still clutched tightly in my hand. The hum was gone, the whispers were gone, but the silence that replaced them was anything but comforting. It was heavy, oppressive, filled with the weight of what I'd just escaped, or what I thought I had. I lay there, staring up at the faint light filtering through the twisted branches above me. My chest heaved as I struggled to catch my breath, the cold air biting at my skin. The pendant in my hand had dimmed, its glow reduced to a faint pulse that barely illuminated my bloodied fingers. The world around me was silent, unnaturally so, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I forced myself to sit up, every muscle in my body screaming in protest. My knees wobbled as I got to my feet, and the forest seemed to tilt for a moment before steadying itself. The ground beneath me was cold, damp, and wrong, as though it didn't belong to the world I knew. I looked back at where the cavern had been, but there was nothing. No sign of the sinkhole, no evidence of the chaos, a just escape, just smooth, untouched earth. The hum was gone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, lingering just below the surface, waiting for the right moment to rise again. The pendant pulsed weakly in my hand, its light flickering like a dying flame. I clutched it tightly, unwilling to let it go. Whatever it was, whatever power it held, it was the only thing keeping me tethered to reality. The shadows in the forest felt heavier now, deeper and more menacing, as though they were watching me. I could feel their weight pressing against my back, the faint rustle of unseen movements sending shivers down my spine. The air was colder than before, carrying with it a faint, acrid scent that made my stomach churn. I didn't know where I was, or how far I'd run, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't safe. A sound broke the silence, a faint, distant crack, like a branch snapping underfoot. My heart jumped, and I spun around, my eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. The trees stood still, their skeletal branches clawing at the sky, but the shadows between them seemed to shift, writhing like living things. My pulse quickened as the crack came again, closer this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. I backed away, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The pendant's glow flared slightly, its light casting long, jagged shadows across the ground. The footsteps grew louder, more deliberate, and I could feel the vibrations in the earth beneath me. Whoever, or whatever, was out there wasn't trying to hide. The first figure stepped into view, and my blood ran cold. It was Mia. It It was Mia. She moved slowly, her limbs stiff and jerky, as though she were being dragged forward by invisible strings. Her head was tilted at that unnatural angle again, and her eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, reflecting the weak pulse of the pendant. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out, her lips forming words I couldn't understand. Behind her, more figures emerged. They were twisted, broken things, their forms barely recognizable as human. Some were missing limbs, their torsos hollowed out and dark, while others had too many, their arms and legs bending in ways that defied logic. Their faces were wrong, distorted and elongated, with mouths that stretched too wide and eyes that stared without seeing. They moved in unison, their jerky, stilted movements synchronized like marionettes, controlled by the same hand. They stopped a few feet away, their heads tilting in eerie synchronization. As they stared at me, the whispers began again, soft and insidious, threading through the air like poison. They didn't come from the figures. They came from the forest itself, from the shadows that writhed between the trees and the earth that pulsed beneath my feet. The pendant flared, its light growing brighter, and the figures recoiled slightly, their movements faltering. I tightened my grip on it, the metal burning against my skin, and took a step back. My mind raced, desperate to find a way out. But the forest seemed to close in around me, the shadows thickening and the whispers growing louder. One of the figures lunged. "That be you?" It moved faster than I expected, its long, jagged limbs reaching for me with impossible speed. I stumbled backward, barely avoiding its grasp, and the pendant's light flared brighter still, sending the figures skittering back into the shadows. The others hesitated, their heads snapping toward me as though waiting for a signal. The ground trembled beneath me, a low, rhythmic vibration that matched the pulse of the pendant. The symbols on its surface glowed fiercely, their light spilling out in jagged beams that cut through the darkness. The figures hissed, their forms flickering like static, and for a moment I thought they might retreat. But then the hum returned. It was louder this time, deeper and more resonant, vibrating through my chest and shaking the ground beneath my feet. The figures straightened, their movements more fluid now, more purposeful. They didn't lunge this time. Envelop, unrust. They advanced slowly, their glowing eyes locked onto me, their jagged limbs stretching and bending as they closed the distance. I backed away, my breaths coming in ragged gasps, and the pendant's light dimmed slightly, as though it were struggling against the darkness. My legs felt heavy, my movements sluggish, as though the air itself was working against me. The whispers grew louder, overlapping and echoing in my mind, drowning out my thoughts. The first figure, Mia, was only a few feet away now, her glowing eyes unblinking as she reached for me. I raised the pendant instinctively, its light flaring weakly, and her form flickered, her movements stuttering like a skipping video. For a brief moment, her face changed. The glowing eyes dimmed, and her mouth formed a single silent word. Run, Noah. The light from the pendant surged, blinding and searing, and the figures screamed, their distorted forms writhing and collapsing into the shadows. The hum faltered, replaced by a deafening silence that pressed against my ears, and the pendant grew cold in my hand. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I turned and ran, my legs carrying me through the twisted forest with a speed I didn't know I had. The whispers followed, faint and desperate. But I didn't look back. I couldn't. The trees thinned, and the faint glow of the town's streetlights came into view. My chest burned, my lungs screaming for air, but I didn't stop until I was standing beneath the dim, flickering light of a street lamp. The pendant in my hand was silent now, its glow completely extinguished, but I could still feel its weight, a cold, unyielding presence that refused to let go. I collapsed onto the curb, my hands shaking as I clutched the pendant tightly. The forest behind me was silent, but I knew better than to believe it was over. The hum was gone, the whispers were gone, but the weight of their presence lingered, a shadow that refused to lift. I wasn't safe. Not yet. The quiet didn't last long. I'd flee. It never did. The streetlight above me flickered, its dull glow barely holding back the encroaching dark. I could feel it, something moving in the shadows, just out of sight, its presence pressing against my skin like a storm waiting to break. My breathing slowed, my fingers tightening around the pendant, its surface cold and lifeless. In my palm, the glow was gone, but its weight felt heavier than ever. The whispers returned, faint and fragmented, threading through the silence like veins of frost creeping across a window. They weren't coming from the forest this time. They were closer, circling me, darting in and out of the edges of my hearing. I turned my head, scanning the empty street, but there was nothing. Just the endless stretch of pavement and the hollow glow of a few scattered lamps. I pushed myself to my feet, my legs unsteady beneath me. The pendant dangled from its chain, swaying slightly as I took a hesitant step forward. The weight of the air around me grew heavier with each breath, thick and stifling, as though the world itself was holding its breath. I didn't know where I was going. There wasn't a plan, not anymore. There was only the constant pull, that invisible thread winding tighter and tighter, dragging me towards something I didn't want to face. The sound of footsteps shattered the quiet, sharp and deliberate against the asphalt. My heart jumped, and I spun around, the pendant swinging in my grip. The street behind me was empty, but the sound continued, growing louder, closer. It wasn't just footsteps anymore. It was a chorus of movements, feet shuffling, joints creaking, the faint scrape of nails against stone. My pulse quickened as shapes began to emerge from the darkness, their forms blurred and shifting, as though the shadows themselves had come alive. They moved slowly, their jagged limbs bending at impossible angles as they advanced. The glow of the streetlights caught on their twisted features, and I felt my stomach churn. These weren't people. They weren't even pretending to be. Their faces were hollow, their eyes empty sockets that burned with a faint, otherworldly light. Their mouths stretched too wide, split at the edges, as though they'd been torn open to make room for something that didn't belong. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and the figures stopped in unison, their heads snapping toward me with a precision that sent a shiver down my spine. My grip on the pendant tightened, and I stumbled backward, my feet dragging against the ground, as though the air itself was pulling me down. One of the figures stepped forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, and the whispers seemed to converge, overlapping into a single guttural sound. My name. My name. It wasn't a scream, but it carried the weight of one. The sound ripped through the air, vibrating in my chest, and I staggered, nearly losing my balance. The pendant in my hand flared to life, its green light blazing like a tiny star, and the figures recoiled, their forms flickering, as though the light had burned through them. I didn't wait for them to recover. My legs moved before my brain caught up, propelling me down the empty street, the sound of my footsteps drowned out by the rising roar of the whispers. The pendant pulsed in my hand, its light guiding me as the shadows closed in from all sides, their jagged shapes darting through the edges of my vision. I turned a corner and froze. The forest was ahead of me again, its twisted trees reaching out like skeletal hands, their shadows pooling together into an impenetrable wall. My breath caught in my throat, and I turned to run in the opposite direction, but the street behind me was gone. The pavement had crumbled away, replaced by the same black shifting void I'd seen in the sinkhole. The ground trembled beneath me, and the air filled with a deep, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through every fiber of my being. The pendant flared brighter, its light cutting through the darkness, but it wasn't enough. The shadows continued to close in, their movements faster, more erratic, as though they were feeding off the fear, coursing through my veins. The hum grew louder, and I fell to my knees, my hands trembling as I clutched the pendant like a lifeline. The symbols etched into its surface glowed fiercely, their patterns shifting and rearranging into shapes I couldn't understand, but somehow recognized. The whispers merged into a single voice, deep and resonant, a sound that didn't belong in this world. You cannot escape. The ground beneath me cracked, a jagged fissure splitting the earth and releasing a wave of searing heat. The void expanded, swallowing the streetlights, the pavement, the air itself, until there was nothing left but the faint, flickering glow of the pendant. The voice came again, closer this time, pressing against my thoughts like a vice. You are the key. Accept it. The pendant burned in my hand, the pain sharp and unrelenting, but I couldn't let go. The symbols on its surface flared, their light piercing through the darkness, and for a brief moment, the world around me seemed to hesitate. The shadows recoiled, their forms unraveling into smoke, and the whispers faltered, their rhythm breaking apart into fragments. But it wasn't enough. The fissure widened, and from its depths, a shape began to rise. It was massive, a towering presence of shadow and light, its form constantly shifting, never settling to something I could comprehend. Its eyes burned with the same green light as the pendant, and its voice filled the air, a resonant hum that made my chest ache. You cannot resist. You are mine. The ground gave way beneath me, and I fell into the darkness, the air rushing past me in a deafening roar. The pendant's light flared one last time, and the voice rose to a crescendo, its words searing into my thoughts as the world dissolved around me. You are the key, and the door is open. The fall felt endless, a descent into a void where gravity held no meaning. The air around me wasn't just cold, it was consuming, clinging to my skin like a second layer of existence. The pendant in my hand burned brighter, its green light cutting through the suffocating blackness. But no matter how fiercely it glowed, it couldn't illuminate whatever lay ahead. I hit the ground hard. The impact jarred every bone in my body, and the pendant slipped from my grip, skittering across the uneven surface. I gasped for air, my lungs heaving against the crushing weight of the atmosphere. The pain was sharp, searing through my limbs, but it was secondary to the terror rising in my chest. Around me, the void shifted, rippling like water, disturbed by an unseen force. I forced myself upright, my hands trembling as I reached for the pendant. Its glow had dimmed to a faint pulse, a heartbeat that felt in sync with my own. The ground beneath me was unlike anything I'd ever felt, neither solid nor liquid, but something in between, as though I were standing on the surface of a living thing. The whispers returned, louder now, weaving through the air in overlapping currents. They weren't just voices anymore. They were thoughts, invasive and unrelenting, clawing their way into my mind. Each one carried a weight, a fragment of something ancient and incomprehensible, and they pulled at the edges of my sanity. You cannot hide, the voice said again, resonating through the void. You cannot run. I staggered to my feet, the pendant clutched tightly in my hand. The light pulsed weakly, but it was enough to illuminate the space around me. The ground stretched endlessly in all directions, broken only by jagged spires that jutted upward like the ribs of a long-dead beast. In the distance, a faint glow marked the horizon, a sickly green light that pulsed in time with the whispers. I moved toward it, my steps unsteady as the ground shifted beneath me. The whispers grew louder with each step, their words sharpening into something almost intelligible. They spoke of hunger, of longing, of an emptiness that could never be filled. They spoke of me, and of what I was supposed to become. The glow grew brighter as I approached, revealing a structure that loomed in the distance. It wasn't a building, not exactly. It was more like a monolith, impossibly tall and jagged, its surface etched with the same shifting symbols that adorned the pendant. The air around it shimmered, distorted, as though reality itself were bending to its will. At its base stood the figure, the same towering, ever-shifting presence that had haunted me since the sinkhole first appeared. Its form was clearer now, more defined, but still impossible to comprehend. Limbs twisted and reformed, faces appeared and dissolved, and its void-like gaze bore into me with an intensity that made my chest tighten. "You are the key," it said, its voice a symphony of tones that vibrated through the air. "And the door is open." The ground beneath me trembled, and cracks spidered outward from the monolith, glowing with a blinding green light. The whispers rose to a deafening pitch, and I fell to my knees, clutching the pendant as its heat seared into my palm. The symbols on its surface flared, matching the light from the cracks, and for a brief moment I felt something shift. The figure stepped closer, its form flickering as it reached toward me. The pendant pulsed violently, its light surging as I held it aloft. And the figure froze, its many faces contorting in what I could only describe as pain. The whispers faltered, their rhythm breaking, and the cracks in the ground widened. "This is not your place," the voice said, its tone sharp and jagged. "You do not belong." The pendant flared again, brighter than before, and the figure recoiled, its form unraveling as though the light were tearing it apart. The ground beneath me buckled, and the cracks erupted, releasing a torrent of black, viscous liquid that hissed and boiled as it met the light. The monolith groaned, its surface fracturing, and the entire space began to collapse. The whispers became screams, desperate and panicked, as the void around me folded in on itself. Self. The figure's form dissolved, its many faces twisting into expressions of rage and fear before disappearing entirely. The pendant burned brighter still, and the light consumed everything, blinding and absolute. When the light faded, I was back. The forest was quiet, the air still and heavy. The pendant lay cool in my hand, its glow completely extinguished, and the ground beneath me was solid once more. I looked around, my breath coming in shallow gasps. But there was no sign of the sinkhole, the monolith, or the figure. It was as if they had never existed. But the silence wasn't comforting. It was oppressive, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. The pendant felt heavier now, its once intricate surface smooth and blank, as though whatever power it held had been spent. I stood, my legs trembling beneath me, and turned toward the town. The trees seemed to part before me, their branches no longer clawing at the sky. The whispers were gone, but their echoes lingered in my mind, a constant reminder of what I had seen, of what I had unleashed. The hum returned, faint and distant, vibrating through the earth beneath my feet. I tightened my grip on the pendant, my pulse quickening as I realized the truth. It wasn't over. The door was open,